What if I told you that somewhere in America, buried in remote locations across multiple states, there are still hidden caches filled with weapons, money, and tools left behind by one of the most calculating serial killers in U.S. history? What if some of those caches have never been found? This is the story of Israel Keyes, a man who spent over a decade methodically preparing for murders that wouldn't happen for years. The FBI calls him the most organized killer they've ever encountered, and they're still trying to solve the puzzle he left behind. Israel Keyes didn't just kill randomly. He planned his murders like a military operation, traveling thousands of miles to bury kill kits in remote locations, then returning months or even years later to retrieve them and commit perfectly executed crimes. He operated in Alaska, Washington, Vermont, New York, Texas, and at least 6 other states. He killed men, women, and children. He had no preferred victim type, no signature, no pattern that investigators could track. He was the perfect predator. But in 2012, he made one critical mistake that led to his capture. And what he revealed during his interrogations shocked even seasoned FBI agents. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Israel Keyes represents every law enforcement officer's worst nightmare, and why his case is still actively being investigated more than a decade after his death. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Richmond, Utah, but his childhood was anything but typical American suburbia. His family belonged to a fundamentalist Christian sect that rejected modern society. They lived off the grid in rural Washington state, homeschooled their children, and avoided contact with law enforcement or government agencies. As a teenager, Keyes began showing signs of antisocial behavior. He tortured animals, started fires, and displayed an unusual fascination with death and violence. But unlike other budding serial killers, Keyes was incredibly intelligent and disciplined. He learned to hide his dark impulses behind a facade of normalcy. In 1998, at age 20, Keyes joined the U.S. Army. He served for 4 years, receiving training in combat, weapons handling, and survival techniques that would later prove invaluable in his criminal career. The military also taught him something crucial: how to plan operations, maintain operational security, and execute missions without leaving evidence. After his discharge in 2001, Keyes moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he started a construction company and seemed to settle into a normal life. He had a daughter, maintained steady employment, and was regarded by neighbors as quiet but reliable. But Israel Keyes was living a double life. While building his legitimate business by day, he was planning and executing one of the most sophisticated killing sprees in American criminal history. Before we dive into the terrifying details of his methods, make sure you're subscribed to Tomorrow's Secrets. We investigate the most chilling true crime cases every week, and trust me, what you're about to hear will change how you think about serial killers forever. What made Israel Keyes different from every other serial killer was his preparation. Starting around 2001, he started what he called his kill cache system. Keyes would travel to remote locations across the United States, sometimes driving thousands of miles, to bury plastic containers filled with everything he needed to commit murder: weapons, zip ties, duct tape, cash, fake identification, and even detailed maps of potential hunting grounds. These weren't random burial sites. Keyes selected locations based on strict criteria: far from populated areas, accessible by vehicle but not visible from roads, in terrain that would preserve his materials for years, and most importantly, in states where he had no personal connections. He documented each kill cache location with GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions, creating what investigators later discovered was essentially a murder supply chain spanning the entire continental United States. The FBI believes Keyes buried at least a dozen of these caches, but they've only recovered a handful. This means that somewhere in America, there are still hidden stockpiles of weapons and tools waiting to be discovered by hikers, hunters, or construction crews. But the kill caches were just the beginning. Keyes developed an entire methodology for committing undetectable crimes. Israel Keyes had 3 fundamental rules that made him nearly impossible to catch. First, never kill close to home. Second, never establish patterns that investigators could track. Third, never leave evidence that could be traced back to him. When Keyes decided to kill, he would travel to a state where he had previously buried a cache, sometimes years earlier. He would retrieve his supplies, then drive to a different city or state entirely to select his victims. His victim selection was truly random. He didn't have a type, preferred age group, or specific method. He would simply drive through neighborhoods until he found what he called an opportunity. A house with poor security, a person walking alone at night, someone who appeared vulnerable. Keyes would conduct surveillance for days or weeks before striking. He studied his victims' routines, mapped escape routes, and planned every detail of the attack. When he finally moved, it was swift, brutal, and left virtually no evidence. After committing murder, Keyes would dispose of the body in a location hundreds of miles from the kill site, often in a completely different state. He would then destroy or abandon his tools, sometimes throwing them in lakes or rivers, and return to Alaska to resume his normal life. This methodology allowed him to operate for over a decade without being connected to any of his crimes. Local law enforcement agencies investigating individual murders had no idea they were dealing with a serial killer who lived thousands of miles away. The FBI has confirmed that Israel Keyes killed at least 11 people between 2001 and 2012, but investigators believe the actual number is much higher. His confirmed victims include Bill and Lorraine Currier, a married couple from Essex, Vermont, who were abducted from their home in June 2011. Keyes had buried a cache in Vermont 2 years earlier, then returned to execute what he described as a practice run for larger operations. The Curriers were chosen completely randomly. He drove through their neighborhood, noticed their house had poor lighting and no security system, and decided they would be his targets. He broke in while they were sleeping, bound and abducted them, then killed them at a remote location. Their bodies have never been found. In Washington state, investigators connected Keyes to several unsolved murders dating back to 2005. In each case, the victims were selected randomly, killed efficiently, and their bodies disposed of in ways that made discovery unlikely. But Keyes's most notorious crime was also his last. In February 2012, he abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig from the coffee stand where she worked in Anchorage, Alaska. This was the first time he had killed close to home, breaking his own fundamental rule. Keyes held Samantha in a shed on his property for several hours before killing her. Then he left for a 2-week vacation cruise with his family, leaving Samantha's body frozen in the shed. When he returned, he dismembered her body and disposed of it in a remote lake. But Keyes wasn't done with Samantha Koenig. He had one more use for her. This next part is particularly disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. Drop a comment below if you think you can handle the truth about what happened next, because it gets much darker. 2 weeks after killing Samantha Koenig, Israel Keyes decided to stage a ransom demand to extract money from her family. But Samantha was already dead, so Keyes had to get creative. He retrieved her body from the lake, took it back to his shed, and staged what appeared to be a proof-of-life photograph. Using makeup to hide signs of decomposition and props to make her appear alive, he created a horrifying piece of evidence that he sent to her family, along with a ransom demand for $30,000. Samantha's family, believing their daughter was still alive, scraped together the money and deposited it into the account Keyes had specified. What they didn't know was that they were paying for the return of someone who had been dead for weeks. This ransom scheme was Keyes's fatal mistake. When he began using Samantha's debit card to withdraw the ransom money, he triggered a series of ATM surveillance cameras across multiple states. The FBI was able to track his movements and identify him as a suspect. On March 13, 2012, Israel Keyes was arrested at a traffic stop in Texas. In his possession were Samantha's debit card, detailed plans for additional murders, and evidence linking him to crimes across the country. But even in custody, Keyes remained in control. He knew exactly how much leverage he had. Israel Keyes spent 8 months in federal custody, and during that time he participated in some of the most chilling interrogations in FBI history. The recordings of these sessions revealed a man who was not just a killer, but a criminal mastermind who understood exactly how the system worked. Keyes was willing to confess to his crimes, but only under specific conditions. He wanted to control the narrative, protect his family from media attention, and ensure he would not face the death penalty. In exchange, he offered to help the FBI solve cold cases across multiple states. What emerged during these sessions was a portrait of a killer unlike any other. Keyes revealed that he had been planning murders for over a decade, had cached supplies across the country, and had killed far more people than the FBI had initially suspected. He described his crimes in clinical detail, showing no remorse or emotion. To Keyes, murder was simply a hobby, like fishing or hunting, something he did for personal satisfaction when the urge struck him. But he was also strategic in what he revealed. He gave investigators just enough information to keep them interested while holding back crucial details that could solve additional cases. He was playing a game, even from behind bars. The FBI learned about the kill cache system, the random victim selection, and the interstate nature of his crimes. But they also realized something terrifying. Keyes had been operating for over a decade without detection, and there was no telling how many victims they would never identify. We're about to reveal what happened when Keyes realized he was losing control of his narrative, so make sure you're subscribed because this case takes a shocking turn that investigators never saw coming. December 2, 2012. Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. He had committed suicide using a bedsheet and a razor blade, but not before leaving behind a final message that continues to haunt investigators. Keyes had written a lengthy suicide note that read like a manifesto, describing his philosophy of killing and hinting at crimes he had never revealed. But most disturbing was his final statement that he had taken his secrets with him and that there were victims whose families would never have closure. His suicide effectively ended the FBI's investigation into dozens of unsolved murders across the country. Without his cooperation, investigators lost their primary source of information about his methodology, victim locations, and the remaining kill caches. But Keyes' death also raised disturbing questions about jail security and the FBI's handling of such a crucial witness. How was he able to acquire the materials needed to commit suicide while under federal custody? Why wasn't he on constant suicide watch, given the importance of his testimony? Some investigators believe Keyes' suicide was his final act of control, a way to ensure that his legacy would remain mysterious and that law enforcement would never fully understand the scope of his crimes. Today, more than 12 years after Israel Keyes' death, the FBI is still actively investigating his case. They've established a task force dedicated to identifying his additional victims and locating the remaining kill caches. Using advanced forensic techniques, investigators have been able to connect Keyes to several previously unsolved murders. DNA evidence, financial records, and cell phone data have helped establish his presence in multiple states during timeframes when murders occurred. But progress is slow. Keyes was so methodical in covering his tracks that each potential connection requires months of investigation to confirm. And without his cooperation, investigators are essentially working backward from crime scenes to try to identify patterns. The FBI has also been working with local law enforcement agencies across the country to review cold cases that might be connected to Keyes. They're looking for murders that occurred near major highways, involved random victims, and showed signs of careful planning. Perhaps most frustrating for investigators is the knowledge that somewhere in America there are still hidden caches of weapons and tools that Keyes buried for future crimes. Each cache represents potential evidence that could solve additional murders, but finding them is like searching for needles in a haystack. The FBI continues to receive tips from hikers, hunters, and construction workers who believe they may have discovered Keyes-related evidence, but so far only a handful of caches have been recovered. The Israel Keyes case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial killer investigations. His methodology exposed critical weaknesses in the way different agencies communicate and share information. Because Keyes operated across state lines and used random victim selection, individual law enforcement agencies investigating his crimes had no way to recognize they were dealing with a serial killer. Each murder appeared to be an isolated incident with no connection to similar crimes in other states. This case led to improved information sharing between agencies, better databases for tracking unsolved murders, and new protocols for investigating crimes that might be part of larger patterns. But Keyes also represents a terrifying evolution in criminal behavior. Unlike traditional serial killers who operate in familiar territory and follow recognizable patterns, Keyes proved that a sufficiently intelligent and disciplined killer could operate indefinitely without detection. His case raises uncomfortable questions about how many other killers might be using similar methodologies. How many unsolved murders across America are actually the work of organized killers who travel between states? How many kill caches are still buried in remote locations waiting to be discovered? What do you think about the Israel Keyes case? Do you believe the FBI will ever fully understand the scope of his crimes? And most disturbing of all, do you think there are other killers out there using similar methodologies right now? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this investigation opened your eyes to the reality of modern serial killing, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next week, we're diving into another case that shattered law enforcement assumptions about how serial killers operate. Another methodical predator, another multi-state investigation, another reminder that evil is often hiding in plain sight. Until then, remember that the most dangerous killers aren't the ones who lose control and make mistakes. They're the ones who plan every detail, leave no evidence, and understand that patience is the ultimate weapon. The truth is always more calculated than we want to believe.